The rain was pouring hard that evening, turning the city streets into rivers of reflected neon lights. Most people were rushing home, holding umbrellas close and dodging puddles, too busy with their own thoughts to notice anything around them. But not Maya. Something made her slow down as she passed the old bookstore that had closed down last month. There, huddled in the doorway, was an elderly woman trying to stay dry. She had a thin jacket pulled tight around her shoulders, and a plastic bag containing what looked like everything she owned sat beside her. The woman wasn't begging or asking for help. She just sat there, dignity intact, watching the rain fall. Maya, a high school senior who'd just finished her evening art class, felt her heart squeeze. She'd seen homeless people before. Living in the city, it was impossible not to. But there was something different about this woman. Maybe it was the way she sat up straight despite her circumstances, or how she'd carefully arranged her few belongings to keep them dry. She reminded Maya of her own grandmother, who'd passed away 2 years ago. The woman must have sensed someone watching because she turned and met Maya's eyes. Instead of looking away like most people would, she smiled, a genuine warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. It wasn't the smile of someone asking for something, it was just a simple human connection. Maya knew her mom always warned her about talking to strangers. The city isn't safe, she'd say. You need to be careful. But Maya also remembered what her dad taught her. Trust your gut feeling. Sometimes the world puts people in your path for a reason. Standing there in the rain, Maya made a decision. She walked over to the doorway, adjusting her umbrella to shield them both from the rain. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm Maya. Would you like to share my umbrella?" The woman looked surprised, as if she wasn't used to people stopping to talk. "That's very kind of you, dear," she said in a voice that was clear and well-spoken. "I'm Rose." Maya noticed Rose's hands were trembling slightly from the cold. "How long have you been sitting here?" "Oh, just since this morning," Rose replied, trying to sound casual, but Maya could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "The rain caught me by surprise." "Have you eaten anything today?" Maya asked, already knowing the answer from the way Rose hesitated. "I had some water," Rose said finally, maintaining her dignity. "The drinking fountain in the park still works." Maya thought about the $20 in her wallet, money she'd saved for lunch tomorrow. But looking at Rose, the decision wasn't hard at all. There was a small diner just around the corner that served hot soup and coffee. "Would you like to get something warm to eat?" Maya asked. "I know a place nearby. Their soup is really good, especially on rainy days like this." Rose started to shake her head. "Oh no, dear, I couldn't possibly." "Please," Maya said, "it would make me happy. Plus, I could use some company." She smiled, remembering how her grandmother used to say that sometimes letting someone help you is a gift to them, not just to yourself. After a moment's hesitation, Rose nodded. Maya helped her gather her few belongings, noticing how carefully Rose folded her thin blanket before putting it in the plastic bag. Together, they walked to the diner, sharing the umbrella and dodging puddles. The warmth of the diner hit them as soon as they opened the door. A few customers looked up, some with curious or disapproving glances, but Maya didn't care. She led Rose to a booth by the window, where they could watch the rain while staying warm and dry. The waitress came over, and Maya could see her expression shift from concern to warmth as Maya ordered soup, coffee, and sandwiches for both of them. As they waited for their food, Rose gradually began to open up. She spoke about the library where she spent her days reading, about the kind librarian who never asked her to leave, about the small things that made each day bearable. Maya found herself sharing too, about her dreams of becoming an artist, her worries about college applications, and funny stories about her family. The conversation flowed naturally, like they were old friends catching up rather than strangers who'd just met. As they talked and ate, Maya noticed something extraordinary about Rose. Despite her circumstances, she spoke with intelligence and insight. She asked thoughtful questions and offered wise advice. There was something almost familiar about her manner, but Maya couldn't quite place it. When they finished eating, Maya insisted on giving Rose the spare blanket she kept in her backpack for cold days at school. "I have others at home," she said when Rose protested. "Please take it. It's supposed to get even colder tonight." As they prepared to leave, Rose reached out and squeezed Maya's hand. "Thank you," she said, her eyes bright with tears. "Not just for the food and blanket, but for seeing me as a person. That's the greatest gift anyone can give." Maya felt her own eyes getting watery. "Will you be okay tonight? I volunteer at the shelter on Oak Street. I could take you there." But Rose gently shook her head. "Don't worry about me, dear. I'll be fine. You've already done more than enough." They parted ways under Maya's umbrella, each heading in opposite directions. Maya turned back once to wave, watching as Rose's figure disappeared into the rainy evening. Something about the encounter left her feeling both happy and unsettled, like there was more to Rose than met the eye. That night, as Maya lay in bed listening to the rain, she couldn't stop thinking about Rose. She had no idea that this simple act of kindness was about to lead to something extraordinary, something that would change not just her life, but her entire community. That night, Maya couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Rose sitting in that doorway, trying to stay dry from the rain. The warm comfort of her own bed made her feel both grateful and guilty. Outside, the storm had gotten worse, with wind rattling the windows and rain drumming against the roof. After tossing and turning for hours, Maya grabbed her phone and started researching local homeless shelters. There were 3 within walking distance of where she'd met Rose. Maybe tomorrow she could check if Rose had made it to one of them. She knew her mom would probably say she was getting too involved, but something about Rose's story just wouldn't let her rest. The next morning at breakfast, Maya couldn't hold it in anymore. While her mom packed lunches and her little brother stuffed his face with cereal, she told them about meeting Rose. "You did what?" Her mom stopped spreading peanut butter on a sandwich and stared at Maya. "How many times have I told you not to talk to strangers, especially after dark?" "Mom, you should have seen her," Maya said, pushing her own breakfast around her plate. She wasn't scary at all. She reminded me of Grandma, actually. The way she spoke, how she held herself, she just needed help. Her dad, who had been quietly listening while sipping his coffee, set down his mug. "Tell us more about her," he said, his voice gentle. Maya's dad had always been the more understanding one, the one who taught her to look for the good in people. So Maya told them everything, about the conversation in the diner, about Rose's intelligence and dignity, about how she refused to go to the shelter. As she spoke, she could see her mom's expression softening. "I keep thinking about her being out there in this weather," Maya finished. "I know you always say we have to be careful, but sometimes being careful means we stop being human, you know." Her little brother, who was usually more interested in his video games than family conversations, looked up. "Is she gonna be okay?" he asked, his spoon forgotten in his bowl. Then Mom sat down heavily in a kitchen chair. "Maya, honey, I understand you want to help. But there are proper channels for this kind of thing. Professional organizations." "Who probably won't find her because she's not asking for help," Maya interrupted. "Mom, please, can we at least drive around and check if she's still there? Maybe offer to take her to a shelter. It's supposed to get even colder tonight." Her parents exchanged one of those long looks that Maya had learned to recognize, the kind where they were having an entire conversation without words. Finally, her dad nodded. "Okay," her mom said, "but we do this as a family, and we're careful. If we find her, we'll offer to take her to the shelter on Oak Street, the one where you volunteer. They're good people there." Maya jumped up and hugged her mom. "Thank you. Can we go now before school?" They piled into the family car, even Maya's little brother, who insisted on bringing along his extra winter coat just in case. As they drove to the bookstore where Maya had first met Rose, she felt a mix of hope and anxiety. What if Rose wasn't there? What if something had happened to her during the night? The doorway was empty when they arrived. The only sign anyone had been there was a small piece of newspaper, damp from the rain. Maya's heart sank. "Let's check the other spots nearby," her dad suggested, noticing her disappointment. Where else might she go to stay dry? They spent the next hour driving around the neighborhood, checking other doorways, the library steps, the bus station. Maya's mom even called the shelters she could find numbers for, but none had seen anyone matching Rose's description. Maybe she found somewhere better to stay, Maya's brother said optimistically, still clutching his coat. "Maybe," Maya replied, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Rose had seemed too put together for someone living on the streets. The way she spoke, her manners, even her posture, It was like she was playing a role rather than living it. As they headed home so Maya could get ready for school, her mom reached back and squeezed her hand. "You did a good thing, honey. Sometimes that's all we can do, show kindness when we have the chance." "But what if she needs more help?" Maya asked, watching the streets pass by through Rain Street windows. "Tell you what," her dad said. "After school, we can put together some care packages. Blankets, food, warm clothes. We'll bring them to the shelter where you volunteer. Even if we can't find Rose, we can help others like her." Maya nodded, but her mind was still spinning with questions. Where had Rose gone? Was she safe? And why couldn't she shake the feeling that there was more to this story than a simple random encounter? Little did Maya know, as she headed to school that morning, that her questions would soon be answered in a way she never could have imagined. Her simple act of kindness was about to unlock a mystery that would change not just her life, but the lives of countless others in her community. That afternoon, as Maya sat in her last class of the day, watching rain continue to fall outside the window, she had no idea that across town, someone was already setting in motion a chain of events that would reveal the true identity of the mysterious woman she knew as Rose, and nothing about that revelation would be what anyone expected. The rest of that school day crawled by slower than any day Maya could remember. She kept checking her phone between classes, hoping somehow Rose would magically appear at one of the shelters her mom had called. During her last period math class, she couldn't focus on equations at all. Her mind kept wandering to the mystery woman who'd touched her heart. When the final bell rang, Maya rushed to her locker, almost dropping her books in her hurry. Her dad had texted that he'd pick her up, and they'd go shopping for those care packages they'd talked about that morning. As she waited by the school entrance, she noticed how the gray clouds still hung heavy in the sky, threatening more rain. "Hey, sweetie," her dad called as he pulled up. "Ready for our mission?" Maya jumped into the car, already pulling out the list she'd made during study hall. "I was thinking we should get thick socks. Everyone always donates regular clothes, but good socks are really important when you're outside a lot." Her dad smiled at her enthusiasm. "That's smart thinking. What else is on that list?" They drove to the store, and Maya's dad didn't even blink at the cart full of supplies they ended up with: warm blankets, protein bars, hand warmers, and yes, lots of thick socks. They also got personal care items, things Maya realized people might be too embarrassed to ask for but desperately needed. "You know what else might be good?" her dad suggested as they loaded everything into the car. "Those little battery-operated lanterns we use for camping. Having light at night can make such a difference." They added a stop at the hardware store to their trip. As they drove to the shelter, Maya noticed her dad taking a route that went past the old bookstore. He slowed down as they passed, both of them scanning the doorway hopefully, but it remained empty. The shelter was busy when they arrived. Maya knew the evening routine well from her volunteer work. This was when people started coming in for the night, hoping to get a bed. The familiar smell of coffee and the day's last meal filled the air. Miss Chen, who ran the shelter's intake desk, smiled when she saw Maya. "2 visits in one day? You're spoiling us." "Have you seen anyone new come in?" Maya asked hopefully. "An older woman, really well-spoken, named Rose." Miss Chen shook her head. "No Rose today, but these supplies are exactly what we need." She helped them unload the car, exclaiming over the thoughtful selections. "The socks especially. People are always asking for good socks." While her dad chatted with Miss Chen about the shelter's other needs, Maya wandered through the common area. The room was filled with people settling in for the night, some reading donated books, others just sitting quietly. She studied each face, hoping to spot Rose, but she wasn't there. A small girl, maybe 7 or 8, was sitting at one of the tables, coloring with stubby crayons. She looked up as Maya passed. "Are you looking for someone?" she asked. Maya nodded. "An older lady named Rose. Have you seen her?" The girl shook her head, then held up her drawing. "But I can help you look. I'm good at finding things. See?" I drew a map of the whole neighborhood. Maya sat down next to her, looking at the colorful, if slightly chaotic, crayon map. "This is really good. What's your name?" "Jenny," the girl said proudly. "My mom and I have been staying here for 2 weeks. Miss Chen says we might get our own apartment soon." As Jenny chatted about her drawings, Maya felt her worry about Rose mixing with a deeper understanding of just how many stories there were in this room. Each person here had their own path that led them to this place, their own hopes and dreams. Later that evening, back at home, Maya sat at the kitchen table with her mom, picking at her dinner. The day's events had left her with a heavy heart. "Mom," she said suddenly, "what if something happened to her? What if she needed help and nobody stopped?" Her mom reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Honey, you did stop. You showed kindness when many people wouldn't have. Sometimes that's all we can do. Plant seeds of kindness and hope they grow." "But it doesn't feel like enough," Maya insisted. "I know," her mom said softly. "But think about Jenny at the shelter. Think about all the others you helped today with those supplies. One person can't solve everything, but every bit of help matters." Maya was about to respond when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Miss Chen. "Someone just came in asking about Rose. Says they have important information. Can you come by tomorrow after school?" Maya's heart jumped. She showed the text to her mom, who read it with raised eyebrows. "Well," her mom said, "looks like this story isn't over yet." That night, as Maya lay in bed, her mind raced with possibilities. Who was asking about Rose? What did they know? The mystery was deepening, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a tiny voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, Rose wasn't exactly who she appeared to be. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Maya had no idea that tomorrow would bring answers that would shock not just her, but her entire community. The true identity of the woman she knew as Rose was about to be revealed, and it would change everything she thought she knew about kindness, appearances, and the power of a simple act of compassion. Maya could barely focus in school the next day. Her mind kept wandering to Miss Chen's text message. Who was this mysterious person asking about Rose? The minutes ticked by like hours until finally the last bell rang. She had already arranged to meet her mom in the school parking lot. No way was her mom letting her go to the shelter alone after such a cryptic message. As they drove, Maya's mom tried to temper her expectations. "Remember, honey, it might not be anything big. Try not to get your hopes up too much." But Maya could tell her mom was curious too, from the way she drove just a little faster than usual and kept checking the time on the dashboard clock. When they arrived at the shelter, Miss Chen was waiting for them at the front desk, but she wasn't alone. A well-dressed woman in her 30s sat nearby, holding a tablet and wearing an ID badge that Maya couldn't quite read. "Maya, Mrs. Chen told me all about your encounter with Rose," the woman said, standing up and extending her hand. "I'm Amy Lee from the Downtown Community Outreach Program. We've been trying to track down Rose for the past few days." Maya's heart started beating faster. Is she okay? Did something happen to her? Amy smiled reassuringly. "Actually, we believe Rose might be someone we've been looking for, but we need your help to confirm it. Could you tell me exactly what she looked like and what you talked about?" For the next 20 minutes, Maya described everything she could remember. Rose's dignified posture, had a well-spoken manner, the way she talked about books at the library. She even remembered small details, like how Rose had carefully folded her blanket before putting it away. As Maya spoke, Amy took notes on her tablet, occasionally nodding. "This matches other reports we've received," she said when Maya finished. "Over the past month, several people have reported similar encounters with an elderly woman matching Rose's description. Each time, she appears in a different part of the city, always during bad weather, and always vanishes after receiving help from someone." "But why?" Maya's mom asked, leaning forward in her chair. "Is she running from something?" Amy glanced at her tablet again. "We're not entirely sure, but we have a theory. Did Rose mention anything about her past? Any details about her life?" Maya thought hard. "Not really. She mostly asked about me and my family. But she did say something about the library being a safe place and how the librarian never asked her to leave." "Interesting," Amy said, making another note. "Because we found something curious. The head librarian at the Central Branch remembers someone matching Rose's description, but not as a homeless person. She remembers her as a regular patron who used to come in wearing expensive clothes and driving a nice car." Maya sat up straighter. "What?" "We've been tracking similar stories across 3 different neighborhoods," Amy continued. Each time, the pattern is the same. She appears vulnerable, accepts help from someone, then disappears. But here's the strange part. Security cameras from nearby businesses show her getting into a luxury car several blocks away. Maya's mom frowned. Are you saying she's not really homeless? That this is some kind of scam? But Amy shook her head. We don't think it's a scam. She never asks for money, and she often refuses help initially. It's almost like she's testing people. Just then, Miss Chen, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. You know who this reminds me of? That story from last year about the millionaire in Boston who would dress up as a janitor to see how his employees treated service workers before promoting them. Maya's eyes widened as pieces started falling into place. Wait, so Rose might be? And he nodded. We think she might be someone very different from who she appears to be. But we need your help for one more thing. Would you be willing to look at some photos? See if you can identify her. She pulled up several images on her tablet. Maya leaned in close, her mom looking over her shoulder. The first few photos weren't Rose, but then... That's her, Maya gasped. The photo showed Rose, but not as Maya had seen her. In this picture, she was elegantly dressed, standing in front of a large building, cutting a ribbon at what looked like a ceremony. The caption read, Local philanthropist opens new community center. Rose isn't her real name, Amy explained gently. Her name is Elizabeth Morrison, and she's one of the city's most private but generous philanthropists. She's known for her unusual methods of choosing causes and people to help. Maya sat back stunned. But why would she pretend to be homeless? That's what we'd like to ask her, Amy said. We've been trying to understand her pattern, and we think she might be looking for something specific, or someone. Maya's mom reached for her hand. Looking for what? Genuine kindness, Annie replied. Someone who helps not because they think they'll get something in return, but simply because it's the right thing to do. Just then, Amy's phone buzzed. She looked at it and smiled. Perfect timing. I just got a message that Mrs. Morrison, Rose, would like to meet with you, Maya. She's asked if you and your family would be willing to come to her office tomorrow afternoon. Maya looked at her mom, who nodded slowly. I think we'd all like to hear what Mrs. Morrison, has to say. As they left the shelter, Maya's head was spinning with questions. The mysterious woman she'd helped wasn't who she appeared to be at all. But somehow, Maya wasn't angry about the deception. Instead, she felt like she was on the edge of understanding something important about human nature and the true meaning of compassion. What she didn't know was that tomorrow's meeting would reveal even more surprises, ones that would not only change her life, but would spark a movement that would touch countless others in ways she could never have imagined. The next morning felt surreal. Maya's mom let her skip school for the afternoon, understanding that this meeting was too important to miss. As Maya stood in front of her closet, she realized she had no idea what to wear to meet a millionaire philanthropist who she'd last seen as a homeless woman in a doorway. Just be yourself, her mom called from the doorway, seeming to read her thoughts. That's who she wanted to meet in the first place. The address Emmy had given them led to a beautiful old building downtown, all brick and gleaming windows. Maya's hands were sweating as they walked through the revolving door into a lobby with marble floors and tall plants. Her little brother, who had begged to come along, kept spinning in circles, staring up at the high ceiling. Mrs. Morrison is expecting you, the receptionist said warmly, leading them to an elevator. Maya's stomach did flip-flops as they rode up to the top floor. The elevator opened directly into a cozy office that looked nothing like what Maya had expected. Instead of being cold and formal, it felt like someone's living room. Comfortable chairs were arranged around a coffee table, and the walls were covered with colorful artwork that looked like it had been made by children. And there, standing by a large window overlooking the city, was Rose, or rather, Mrs. Morrison. She was wearing an elegant blue suit now, but Maya would have recognized her anywhere. She had the same warm eyes, the same gentle smile. Maya, she said, walking over with her arms outstretched. And this must be your wonderful family. Please, come sit down. We have so much to talk about. As they settled into the chairs, Maya noticed a familiar blanket folded neatly on a shelf, the one she'd given Rose that rainy night. Her heart did a little jump. First, Mrs. Morrison said, I owe you all an apology for my deception. But I also owe you an explanation. She sat down across from them, her hands folded in her lap. "Would you like to hear my story?" Maya nodded eagerly, and her little brother whispered, "Is it like a spy story?" Mrs. Morrison laughed, the same warm laugh Maya remembered from the diner. "Not quite, young man. But it is a story about looking beneath the surface of things." She took a deep breath and began. 40 years ago, I was actually homeless. Not pretending, really homeless. I had lost everything, my job, my apartment, my sense of dignity. I spent 3 months on the streets, and in that time, I learned more about human nature than I had in all my years before. Maya's mom reached for her dad's hand as Mrs. Morrison continued. "Some people looked right through me, like I was invisible. Others crossed the street to avoid me. A few threw coins without even looking at my face. But then one day, a young girl about Maya's age stopped. She didn't just give me money. She sat down next to me, asked my name, listened to my story. She brought me a hot meal and helped me connect with a shelter that eventually helped me get back on my feet." "What happened to her?" Maya asked softly. "I never saw her again," Mrs. Morrison replied. "But I never forgot her kindness. It gave me back my belief in myself, in humanity. After I got back on my feet, I worked hard, very hard. I started a small business that grew into a large one. I invested wisely, and I made a promise to myself that when I had the means, I would find a way to recognize and reward that kind of genuine compassion." She stood up and walked to her desk, returning with a folder. "So twice a year, I spend a week on the streets in different neighborhoods. I'm not just testing people, I'm looking for those rare individuals who still see the humanity in everyone, regardless of their circumstances." Maya's little brother raised his hand like he was in school. "But isn't that dangerous?" Mrs. Morrison smiled. "I have security watching from a distance, and I choose my locations carefully. But you're right, it's not something anyone should try without proper support." She opened the folder. "Maya, what you did that night, stopping to help a stranger, sharing not just your resources but your time and compassion, that's exactly what I've been looking for. But what happened next impressed me even more. You didn't just help and forget. You worried. You came back. You involved your family in trying to help. You even inspired them to create care packages for others." Maya felt her face getting warm. "I just did what felt right." "Exactly," Mrs. Morrison said. "That's precisely why I'm starting a new program, and I'd like you to help me design it." She pulled some papers from the folder. "I'm establishing a foundation that will support young people who show exceptional compassion and community spirit. It will provide scholarships, but more importantly, it will give them resources to expand their impact on the community." Maya's parents leaned forward as Mrs. Morrison explained the details. The foundation would provide not just money for college, but funding for community projects, mentorship programs, and support for other young people who wanted to make a difference. "Maya," Mrs. Morrison said, "I'd like you to be our first recipient. But more than that, I'd like you to help shape how this foundation will work. You understand better than most adults that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can spark the biggest changes." Maya felt tears welling up in her eyes. Her mom was already crying, and even her dad was blinking suspiciously fast. "Can I help too?" Her little brother piped up, making everyone laugh. "Of course," Mrs. Morrison said, "this is going to be a family affair, because that's another thing Maya taught us, that compassion grows best when it's shared." As they continued talking, making plans and sharing ideas, Maya realized that this was more than just a happy ending to their story. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would ripple out into the community in ways none of them could fully imagine yet. And it all started with a simple choice to stop, to see someone in need, and to care. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Maya's life had completely transformed since that rainy evening when she'd first met Mrs. Morrison. The local newspaper had picked up their story, and suddenly, people wanted to hear about the teenager who had shown kindness to a disguised millionaire. But Maya was determined to keep the focus where it belonged, on helping others. She sat at her kitchen table one evening, surrounded by papers and her mom's homemade cookies, working on plans for the foundation with Mrs. Morrison. "I think we should start at my school," Maya said, dunking a cookie thoughtfully. "There are so many students who want to help but don't know how to begin." Mrs. Morrison nodded, making notes on her tablet. "What do you have in mind?" "Well, remember Jenny from the shelter? Her drawing of the neighborhood map gave me an idea. What if we created a program where students could use their talents to help others? Artists could brighten up the shelter walls, math tutors could help kids with homework, music students could perform for the elderly. Her little brother, who was supposedly doing his homework but mostly stealing cookies, perked up. Could I teach people how to make video games? I'm learning coding. Mrs. Morrison smiled. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. Everyone has something to offer, something to teach. The Foundation's first official meeting was held in the school gymnasium. Maya had been nervous about how many people would show up, but by the time she stepped up to the microphone, the bleachers were packed. Students, teachers, parents, and community members filled every seat. "Hi everyone," Maya began, her voice shaking slightly. She saw her parents giving her encouraging thumbs up from the front row. Most of you probably read about how I met Mrs. Morrison, but today isn't about that story. It's about writing new stories, all of us together. As she explained the Foundation's plans, she could see people leaning forward, whispering excitedly to each other. When she mentioned that every student who volunteered would be eligible for both community service hours and potential scholarship opportunities, the whispers turned to cheers. But the real excitement came when Mrs. Morrison announced the first round of community project grants. Any student can propose a project to help our community, she explained. The Foundation will provide funding, mentorship, and support to make it happen. Hands shot up all over the gymnasium. One girl wanted to start a weekend food program for students who might not have enough to eat at home. A boy suggested creating a free tech repair clinic for seniors. Another student proposed organizing transportation for people who couldn't get to medical appointments. Maya watched in amazement as more and more ideas poured out. Mrs. Morrison had been right. Sometimes people just needed an opportunity to help, and they would rush to take it. After the meeting, Jenny and her mom came up to talk to Maya. They had big news. They'd finally gotten their own apartment, thanks partly to the shelter's housing program. But guess what? Jenny said, bouncing with excitement. Mom got a job at Mrs. Morrison's company, and I'm going to help design posters for the Foundation. Mrs. Morrison said my neighborhood map was visionary. Jenny's mom wiped away tears as she hugged Maya. You started all of this, she said. One simple act of kindness, and look what it's grown into. The local news station came to cover the Foundation's first project, renovating a rundown community center. Maya's former art teacher led a team of students in painting murals on the walls, while others cleaned, repaired, and organized. Maya's little brother even set up a computer lab where he could teach his coding classes. Mrs. Morrison worked alongside everyone else, wearing old jeans and a paint-splattered t-shirt. You know, she said to Maya during a water break, I've done a lot of charity work over the years, but this is different. This isn't just about giving money or resources. It's about building connections, teaching young people that they have the power to make real change. Maya looked around at all the activity. Students she'd never seen talking to each other before were now working together, laughing, sharing ideas. Even some of the tough kids from school had shown up, and they turned out to be amazing at fixing things. It's like dropping a stone in a pond, Maya said. The ripples just keep spreading. Mrs. Morrison squeezed her shoulder, and we're just getting started. That evening, Maya sat on her front porch, watching the sunset and thinking about everything that had happened. A car pulled up, and she recognized Jenny's mom dropping off some supplies for tomorrow's workday. Maya, Jenny called, running up to the porch. Look what I drew. She held up a new picture. This time it showed the community center, surrounded by smiling people of all ages. It's beautiful, Maya said. Want to help me plan where to hang it? As they sat together on the porch steps, planning and dreaming, Maya thought about that rainy night that had started it all. She just wanted to help one person, but that simple decision had sparked something much bigger than herself. The Foundation was already planning to expand to other schools in the district. Other cities were calling, asking how they could start similar programs. What had begun as one girl helping a stranger in the rain was growing into a movement. But more importantly, it was changing how people saw each other. Students who'd never spoken before were becoming friends. People were starting to look up from their phones, to notice when others needed help. The invisible walls between different parts of the community were starting to come down. And it all started with a choice, a simple choice to stop, to care, to help. As the sun set and Jenny chattered about her plans for more artwork, Maya smiled. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. You just have to be brave enough to take that first step. 1 year later, Maya stood on a stage much bigger than the school gymnasium, her heart pounding as she looked out at the crowd. The National Youth Leadership Conference had invited her to share the story of how one random act of kindness had transformed an entire community. "I never planned to start a movement," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I just couldn't walk past someone who needed help. But that's the funny thing about kindness. It grows in ways you never expect." The screen behind her showed photos of what their foundation had accomplished in just 1 year. The renovated community center bustling with activity, Jenny's artwork decorating the walls of 3 different shelters, Maya's little brother teaching coding to a room full of eager kids, the weekend food program that now served hundreds of families. But the numbers and achievements aren't the real story, Maya continued. The real story is about connection, about what happens when we stop seeing people as categories, homeless, student, rich, poor, and start seeing them as individuals with stories, dreams, and something to offer. She told them about Mrs. Morrison's latest project, a program where former shelter residents who had gotten back on their feet became mentors for others going through tough times. Jenny's mom was one of the first mentors, using her experience to help other single parents navigate the system and find resources. The most amazing thing, Maya said, is watching how people's attitudes have changed. "Last week, I saw a group of high school athletes helping elderly residents plant a community garden. The captain of the football team now spends his Saturdays teaching kids to read at the library. The girl who used to sit alone at lunch is running art therapy sessions at the senior center." In the front row, Mrs. Morrison wiped away a tear as Maya continued. "We learned something important this year. Kindness isn't just about giving things to people who need them. It's about giving people the chance to give back. Everyone has something valuable to contribute." She shared how the foundation had spread to 30 other schools across the country, each putting their own spin on the program. One school started a bike repair shop where students fixed up old bicycles for people who needed transportation to work. Another created a translation service to help immigrant families navigate healthcare and education systems. "But you know what makes me proudest?" Maya asked, her voice softening. "It's the small things. The student who notices when someone sits alone at lunch and invites them over. The kid who helps an elderly neighbor carry groceries. The teenager who takes time to really listen when someone is having a bad day." The screen showed a recent photo of the old bookstore where she'd first met Mrs. Morrison. It had been renovated into a community workspace where people could use computers, attend workshops, or just have a warm place to spend the day. The doorway where she found Rose now had a plaque that read, "Kindness starts here." "We call it the ripple effect," Maya explained. "One act of kindness inspires another and another until you can't even trace where it began anymore. And the beautiful thing is, anyone can start those ripples. You don't need money or special skills. You just need to be willing to see people, really see them, and take that first step to help." She told them about a letter she'd received last week from a girl in another state who'd started her own foundation chapter. The girl had written, "I used to think I couldn't make a difference because I'm just a kid. Now I realize that being young is actually an advantage we haven't learned to look away yet." As Maya wrapped up her speech, she shared one final story. "Yesterday, I was walking home from school when I saw an elderly man struggling with some heavy bags. I stopped to help him, and he asked why I was being so kind to a stranger. I told him there's no such thing as strangers, just friends we haven't met yet. Then I realized I was standing in almost exactly the same spot where I'd met Mrs. Morrison a year ago." The audience laughed as Maya grinned. "I checked. It wasn't Mrs. Morrison in disguise this time, but it didn't matter, because that's not why we help people. We don't do it for rewards or recognition. We do it because it's right, because it's human, and because every single time we choose kindness, we make the world a little bit better." The applause was thunderous as Maya finished. But the real reward came later, when person after person came up to share their own stories of kindness received and given, each one adding another ripple to the wave of change that had started with one girl, one rainy night, and one simple choice to stop and help. That evening back home, Maya sat with her family and Mrs. Morrison in their backyard. Jenny was there too, showing everyone her latest artwork, a series of paintings that would decorate the new youth center they were planning. Did you ever imagine, Maya's mom asked Mrs. Morrison, when you started your undercover project, that it would lead to all this? Mrs. Morrison shook her head, smiling. I was looking for one person with a kind heart. Instead, I found a spark that lit up an entire community. Sometimes the best plans are the ones that grow beyond what we could have imagined. Maya looked around at her expanded family, related not by blood but by shared purpose and compassion. She thought about all the lives that had been touched, all the connections made, all the barriers broken down. And she knew that this wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. Because kindness, once planted, grows in ways you can never predict. It jumps fences, crosses boundaries, and spreads light into the darkest corners. And sometimes, all it takes to start that growth is one person willing to stop to city to care. She told them about a letter she'd received last week from a girl in another state who'd started her own foundation chapter. The girl had written, I used to think I couldn't make a difference because I'm just a kid. Now I realize that being young is actually an advantage. We haven't learned to look away yet. As Maya wrapped up her speech, she shared one final story. Yesterday, I was walking home from school when I saw an elderly man struggling with some heavy bags. I stopped to help him, and he asked why I was being so kind to a stranger. I told him there's no such thing as strangers, just friends we haven't met yet. Then I realized I was standing in almost exactly the same spot where I'd met Mrs. Morrison a year ago. The audience laughed as Maya grinned. I checked. It wasn't Mrs. Morrison in disguise this time, but it didn't matter, because that's not why we help people. We don't do it for rewards or recognition. We do it because it's right, because it's human, and because every single time we choose kindness, we make the world a little bit better. The applause was thunderous as Maya finished. But the real reward came later, when person after person came up to share their own stories of kindness received and given, each one adding another ripple to the wave of change that had started with one girl, one rainy night, and one simple choice to stop and help. That evening back home, Maya sat with her family and Mrs. Morrison in their backyard. Jenny was there too, showing everyone her latest artwork, a series of paintings that would decorate the new youth center they were planning. Did you ever imagine, Maya's mom asked Mrs. Morrison, when you started your undercover project, that it would lead to all this? Mrs. Morrison shook her head, smiling. I was looking for one person with a kind heart. Instead, I found a spark that lit up an entire community. Sometimes the best plans are the ones that grow beyond what we could have imagined. Maya looked around at her expanded family, related not by blood but by shared purpose and compassion. She thought about all the lives that had been touched, all the connections made, all the barriers broken down. And she knew that this wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. Because kindness, once planted, grows in ways you can never predict. It jumps fences, crosses boundaries, and spreads light into the darkest corners. And sometimes, all it takes to start that growth is one person willing to stop to city to care.